Hello everyone, welcome to the Wellbeing Pod. I am Divisha and I have with me today Emmanuel and Nancy Veerayen. So for today, for our first episode in that fourth season, we'll talk about inclusive voices shaping diversity in education. So I will leave the floor to Nancy Veerayen to introduce herself, share a little bit of her background as a lecturer and researcher, and also maybe how she became interested in the different areas that she specializes in. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Davisha, and thank you, Emmanuel. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, or whatever time or place you are listening to this podcast. My name is Nancy Veerayen. I'm a lecturer in international education and development at Middlesex University, Mauritius. In terms of my academic and professional journey, I think it began with a true belief for education, equality, and social change. Before working at Middlesex University, Mauritius, I actually qualified as a social worker, in fact, an international social worker, and then later qualified as a lecturer in tertiary education. But based on my social work and educator role, my work history has included community development, working with children and families, teaching, and country capacity building. My personal and work experiences led me to recognize the importance, always an importance, of consulting those it concerns when making decisions that will impact on their lives or their well-being. So in terms of, as a researcher, it comes as no surprise that my doctorate explores using appreciative inquiry, which incidentally is my study methodology, to identify what are the core elements of satisfaction that students look for to know that they are satisfied. And anyone who works in higher education will know that student satisfaction is one of the main driving forces of our profession. So my study stems from my desire to make education, especially at an offshore smaller campus like we are, more inclusive and reflective of the diverse voices within our student population that can sometimes get overlooked in the global education arena. And particularly working with students from different backgrounds, working with students from different backgrounds, reinforced the power that education holds in bringing and bridging the cultural divides. And that's where my passion for diversity and inclusion really solidified in Mauritius.
That's very impressive. I actually didn't know these things about you. So it's an impressive profile and track record, if I may say. Really good to know these things.
Yeah, it is quite impressive. Like, I also didn't know that Nancy worked in social work.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really nice, and yeah, it's just really impressive actually. So thank you, Nancy. I'd like to know a bit what diversity means to you, and maybe also how you've experienced it in your own life in uni or school.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. I think diversity can mean many things to many people, and this is a thought I have on it now, and it's not constant. I think diversity is ever evolving, and perhaps if I was asked this question, if I'm asked this question, in a year's time, it will change as well. But for the time being, diversity to me means learning to feel comfortable to admit the necessary. And I say necessary because we are not the same and we can't be the same. We're all unique, but to admit that there are differences between individuals, and those differences can be by race, culture, gender, religion, and our perspectives. And I think those differences inevitably will have an impact on us and our decisions and our surroundings, and the impact can be positive or negative. Something I hear very often when diversity is discussed is perhaps a cliche that diversity is ensuring everyone feels seen, everyone feels valued, and everyone feels empowered. I don't think it's as easy as this. I think this is a goal, and it's a good goal, but it's working towards that goal. I think living in Mauritius, as well as having lived in the UK, Mauritius is a multicultural island, and I think for people who visit the island and people who live on the island, they experience firsthand how different cultures can coexist. But I think that coexistence is only possible when there's a genuine intent to understand others. Because if there isn't that genuine intention, it's very easy for the differences, the disparities, the misunderstandings to arise. And that's where you experience clash or racism, oppression, discrimination. And so the goal of celebrating diversity, I think, needs to be taught. And I think that universities are good places, a good place to start the conversations about how we learn to understand, express, and communicate about diversity. For me personally, I'm born from a multicultural family, so I'm very used to diversity. For me, it seems very normal, but this may not be the case for many people. And so it's about how do we bridge that gap so as in a multicultural world that we can deepen a commitment to foster inclusivity, so people who perhaps ordinarily have been overlooked or not heard have a voice that is heard. Or an unintentional message to exclude those who do not speak that language you are using. Mm-hmm. So here, language becomes a weapon. Mm-hmm. I do reinforce English in the classroom, but I do know that, if I may use the example, with no disrespect to Mauritian students, that Creole is spoken amongst Mauritian students. The issue is not how many times I remind students to speak English. I think the issue here is understanding the long-term impact it has on hindering, bridging the cultural gaps and forming relationships in the classroom. And I think very often it's not until you feel excluded or you feel the minority that this feeling becomes real and you begin to understand the other person's perspective of what you may be doing unintentionally in the classroom. If that makes sense.
It does.
Thank you, Nancy, for highlighting that point, because as an international student, I totally relate to what you're saying about how sometimes, it may not be intentional. And it's natural for most people to just revert to their mother tongue whenever they're in a group, but that can also create a barrier, especially in forming friendships in the class, because you might want to speak to someone, but because they are speaking their mother tongue and you do not speak that or understand it, then you tend to just, stay in your lane, or you end up not reaching out and maybe making friends or stuff like that. So, Nancy, I'd just like to maybe get your thoughts on what you think educators and academic institutions can do to make students from everywhere feel like heard and seen.
Okay, I think it starts. I mentioned it earlier in my in the point I raised earlier. It starts with intentionality. I think educators, institutions, and organizations must actively seek towards creating environments that promote, that celebrate, and respect diversity. To feel included, heard, means you belong. Again, it sounds logical and easy, but it takes time and it takes coordination. Belong means in higher education and organizations that no matter how big or small, or if it's been in the past, the present, or the future, the contribution is being acknowledged, it's being showcased, it's being promoted. In terms of higher education, the advancement of decolonizing the curriculum is a good and a very long-awaited beginning. More importantly, I think institutions need to continually assess their policies and their practices to make sure that they are genuinely inclusive with intention and not just ticking boxes because it's the expected.
Yeah, because that's the trend we sort of see a bit everywhere now. Like people just try to, get students from maybe different backgrounds, take a picture together and, get it done for on paper, not really done. So yeah, that's a really important point as well. Thank you.
In the various years that you've been a lecturer, what challenges maybe you've encountered to create an inclusive classroom, and maybe how did you address them?
Thank you for the question. One ongoing challenge is overcoming the unconscious bias that enters the classroom. And unconscious is sometimes people don't know they carry this bias. And these biases can manifest in subtle ways when we do activities such as group dynamics, class participation. If you're an employee working for an organization, it may be within the team, and it can be something as more obvious as only certain voices dominate, while others are more prominent. But if I return back to the classroom, how I try to address this, and I actually only did this yesterday, is by setting ground rules. And the ground rules are based around creating an etiquette, an acceptable etiquette for everybody in the classroom, which hopefully demonstrates respect and inclusion from the onset. And the group, the class, the team then agree to these ground rules that they will demonstrate, but they will also call out if it's not being respected. In education, I will use group activities that mix students from different backgrounds and abilities and skill levels, inviting people to contribute. And like I said, I think the same applies for employees and employers. Instead of ground rules, there would be the codes of conduct. And I think the key thing with ground rules and codes of conduct is enforcement. If there isn't enforcement, it's just a document, rather than an actual real culture within an organization. And when there is enforcement, it sets a precedence to deal with things that people believe are important. It breaks down barriers and it sends a signal that diversity is present. It's a learning asset rather than a source of division.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a really it's a strong point you have there, Nancy, and I think it's a really good way as well to, foster inclusion in the classroom because yeah, having rules as you said, like enforcing them, it allows for the marginalized or like the more quiet ones to, also be able to have a voice and um speak up, like when there are things that do not go right, if I can say so.
Sure. I mean, like I said,
Over the years.
it sets the trend. You've already started a culture in the classroom of how, everyone would like it to be.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah.
Would you have any kind of advice, maybe? It starts in the classroom, but sometimes it's not always um, the same principles, if I might say, in the bigger institution, in the bigger organization. Would you say that it would be possible for us maybe to replicate what happens in the classroom to the bigger organization so that everyone kind of follows that inclusive culture?
I think what we say in education is that it's transferable learning. So if within preschool, primary school, secondary school, and tertiary education, principles of diversity are taught, and it's explained that how it can be practiced with intention. When graduates leave university, haven't had an education of understanding diversity, how to deal with it, how to talk about sensitive topics, how to acknowledge and maybe hear another perspective, I think it naturally falls into the workplace.
Mm.
What you've been taught
Mm,
is just an extension to your workplace, that you've had the safe environment to practice this, learn it, that when you go to work, hopefully you have the confidence and the courage to address when you think that there are practices and policies that are not showing genuine intention to celebrate, embrace, or introduce diversity. That's what I think it starts with the people. The people form the policies.
Mm.
yeah,
Very
it
true on that.
definitely does. Yeah. Um, so maybe over the years, have you noticed any changes in like how academic institutions talk about diversity, like, compared to a few years ago?
Sure. I think with decolonizing education, that's a start, but definitely there's been progress in the way institutions are trying to address diversity.
Yes.
On an operational level, there are
Mm,
conversations around inclusion, equity, and now belonging. Is sometimes known as equality, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, but they're now including B, belonging. That's progressing. And I think more obvious areas like disability, gender,
mhm,
and sexuality are usually flagged as how organizations are addressing this. And these are seen as like the beacons of change. But I think there's far more contentious issues such as free speech, tokenism, nepotism, and cultural appropriation, which requires bolder action for change. I think we're moving in the right direction, but there's certainly much more work to be done to ensure that these conversations translate into meaningful action across all levels of education and beyond.
Mm. So there's still a lot of work to do. And I guess,
We've only just started, really. You know, I don't think anyone can say everything's been covered. You know, every aspect now has been considered and is now being addressed. No, that's not the case.
And I think when it comes to human beings and the intricacies of us, we'll always be learning different aspects of human beings and you know, culture and how we interact with each other. So there'll always kind of be a long way to go because we'll always be learning about each other and how to include, make everyone feel included in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's kind of a daily work, like it just never ends.
Exactly, yeah.
And I believe maybe it should be like a joyful journey to be on because we get to learn how other people are, how they live, how they have a different principle, practices, values, and it gets to be something that we discover along our own journey in a way.
Sure. And I think that's the goal, that's the dream, but the reality is also that there are certain cultures, communities, individuals that don't embrace diversity because it's a loss of power.
Mm.
And so to remain with a particular perspective maintains power and control. Diversity can take away some of that power and control, which not everybody is comfortable with.
And I guess this is where the most work has to be done.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And it's possibly because we're having this conversation because we are perhaps on the line of thinking of celebrating diversity. But there can be people among us who don't think that way at all.
Last question from us before we leave the floor to reflection, Nancy. If you could change one thing about how diversity is handled in the classrooms today, what would it be and why?
If I could change one thing, it would be to embed a culture of active inclusion. And active is the key word. Otherwise, it's just passive acceptance. If it's not active inclusion and it's passive acceptance, it means that often we talk about diversity in terms of tolerance. And if it's tolerance, it means we're simply putting up with differences rather than really acknowledging, embracing, celebrating difference. And if you put up with something deep down, it means you don't accept, but you've learned how to be quiet about what you don't like. So instead, with active inclusion, we should be fostering curiosity, engagement with difference, teaching students not just to accept, but to actively seek out and hear diverse perspectives. You know, everyone can encourage dialogue in and out of the classroom that provoke or stimulate different perspectives. And those perspectives sometimes may be sensitive subjects like religion, politics, war, families, discrimination, racism, violence, corruption, the list goes on. We can talk about this, although sometimes people are nervous at talking about this. What needs to be taught is how do we formulate the questions, sensitive questions, so as we can really hear and understand the reply. Because when we hear the reply, that's when we begin to develop the real diverse way of knowing. And when we explore those alternative viewpoints, we can then begin to form our own opinions and our moral position. But this shift would encourage deeper understanding and support a more authentic, collaborative, empathetic learning environment for everyone, rather than, like I said, this passive acceptance. we can be as bold as to say, like, pretending
Mm.
to be diverse and accepting difference.
Mm. Thank you so much, Nancy, for coming in today and sharing a little bit of I would say, the first steps for us to understand more and maybe engage more into strategies and things that we can implement, action-based ones. It's good, of course, you've got ideologies and conversations, like you said, but it's even better to have them implemented and to see actions progressing.
And I'd like to say thank you to you and Emmanuel and the Wellbeing Service for inviting me to talk about this very serious issue. I think your service is, like I said, in the right direction of addressing or beginning the conversations about a very, very important topic. And I'd like to encourage listeners who are listening to this podcast to remind them that there's a wealth of resources on the World Wide Web, that if you want to learn what is diversity and how to educate yourself and others, I'd encourage you to not just listen to this podcast, but to search for that information on the wealth of resources that exist.